Should you get IDP is a question that I believe a lot of people might be asking themselves because the new box has IDP in it. And IDP is a very good card, obviously. This card is limit free and all limit free traps are good to some degree. IDP, in case you don't know, has the effect to target one monster in your opponent's graveyard, special summon it to your field, and negate its effects, and also you could banish one monster from both players' fields that have the same type as each other. You can only use this effect once per turn, so it is hard once per turn. This card is game-winning against some decks. Some decks heavily rely on the graveyard, so you can just steal your opponent's monsters from their graveyard and stop them from using it to do their own combo, and at the same time banish an opponent's monster without even targeting. This is devastating against decks like Orcust, which are based around one single type, which are machines, for example, so you can both get rid of a monster in their graveyard and get rid of a monster on their side of the field. And the fact that this card doesn't target is also really good, because you can choose the target after you have resolved the effect already, so your opponent can't dodge it with something like the Tenyi spell that allows them to tribute their own monster, because if they tribute their own monster, you can just, choose another monster because you haven't chose your target yet. And that is just a really good type of a removal to have. But you guys all probably know that IDP is very good and how IDP is used in the game. Is IDP worth your gems? My short answer is no. Even though this card is obviously very good and it wins games on its own, I think it is just not generic enough to be worth your money on. And the box it is in is not very good. These are the two main reasons that I don't recommend people spending their money or gems on this card. I think in terms of like limit free traps, Compulse and Crackdown are much better options. First of all, Compulse and Crackdown are completely generic, so even if your opponent are playing different monsters with different types, you can still always use Compulse and Crackdown and it will still work pretty much every single time, because IDP becomes a lot less good when your opponent plays a deck with a lot of different types in it. So you can only use the first effect but not be able to banish a monster with both in both players' fields that have the same type. I mean, getting rid of one monster in your opponent's graveyard is still useful, but it is a lot less good than just removing a monster on your opponent's side of the field. So Compulse is really good in that it gets rid of your opponent's monster without destroying it, and it also goes to the hand or the extra deck if it's an extra deck monster, which is really important because the extra deck is a hidden information zone. So if your opponent has something like a Yubel fusion monster like Kluger triggers when it leaves the field, and special summons a Neo's Wiseman from your hand or deck, but if it goes back to the extra deck, it is going back in the face down inside the extra deck, and because the extra deck is a hidden information zone, that effect won't trigger even though it technically left the field. So if you use something like an IDP, you will be able to use the effect of Kluger, which really sucks because Neo's Wiseman is a pain to deal with. And also, the Yubel Neo's deck itself doesn't really use a lot of spellcaster monsters other than exactly Neo's Kluger, so that would be an example of a deck that IDP just isn't very good against. You could use IDP to get rid of Ultimate Nightmare, which is nice, but it really limits the choices of monsters that you can get rid of with IDP. And the second reason of IDP being not as good as Compulse and Crackdown is that it is hard once per turn. I know that this doesn't really come up that often, but if you do draw multiple copies of this card, you will really hate yourself because you can only use one of them in a single turn. And that does come up quite a bit when I was using this card at free copies. Obviously, you can kind of avoid this by just having one copy or two copies in your deck, so you don't have as many copies in your hand as you would want. So even if you do decide to play IDP, you don't really need 3 copies of this card. You can just play 1 or 2 and it's probably going to be good enough. And third and most important reason of why I personally don't recommend playing this card, or I mean investing in this card, is because the box it is in is just not very good. Phoenix Blaze is not a bad box, but it is full of just okay cards. I think the best deck in this box is probably going to be Constellars, but realistically, in a Constellar deck, you only need 1 or 2 copies of the Constellar level 4 super rare, and you don't need anything else in this box, so even if you do decide to get the Constellar stuff, you don't really need multiple copies of this box, and you can just stop immediately as soon as you get 1 or 2 copies of this card. The other stuff is all kind of mid, you know, Ra is kind of meh, it dies to 1 back row. Shadows is okay, it uses up your entire hand to make a Winda that dies to 1 Book of Moon. Mayakashi's is like decent, but you do need some of the older cards, which is in a much older mini box. And the Citadel and Cosmo Town at 3 really hurts the playability of those 2 decks. Those 2 decks would otherwise be a lot better than they are, but now they can't really play the limit 3 traps, or for the case of Machinas, they can't play the Orca stuff. And Sue ships are fine, but nothing too remarkable. So basically this is a very skippable box, and I don't think getting in just because you want a copy of IDP will be a good idea. I'd much rather go to some of the selection boxes where the other cards are in. For example, Crackdown is in a super mini box that comes out once in a while, and it is much more easier to get this card in that super mini box than it is to get these limit 3 staples from their own main boxes that they are officially released in. Or you can get something like Terrors of the Overroot, which I don't know if it's even in the popular list. I'm sure it's somewhere. Terrors of the Overroot is kind of like an IDP that's less situational, but also a lot easier to get. Even though it doesn't really banish a monster on your opponent's side of the field, it does send it to the graveyard, and also it does remove 1 monster in their graveyard, or even spell or traps if you want to. But it is a lot more generic, and it does kind of do what IDP does. And it's also a lot easier to obtain just because it is from a super mini box, and those boxes are incredibly small, so if you have gems or money, it's much easier to just wait for those boxes to come out again and just spend your gems or money on those instead. So basically, IDP is just a situational card that really depends on the meta on when it's good or not. And even though it won't be completely useless because you can still steal opponents' monsters from their graveyard, it really hurts how useful it is compared to the other limit 3 traps like Compulse or Crackdown, at least in my opinion. But let me know what you think in the comments, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching, and goodbye.